Good afternoon. In this video, I'll walk you through how you can configure your Spring Boot 3 application to use Log4j to do your logging instead of relying on the default logging implementation, which is Logback. To start off, you'd like to go to your build file. I'm using Gradle in this case, but the same can be done with Maven. So the first thing you want to do is you want to exclude the Spring Boot starter logging module, because that module will bring in log back and you want that to be excluded so that you can include log4j. The easiest way I find to do that is to head to your configurations block and add add an all configuration and an exclude directive, which specifies the group and the module that you want to exclude. And this will ensure that in any of your dependencies, if anything transitively relies on the Spring Boot starter logging module, which will bring in logback, that it will be excluded as a transitive dependency on all of those imports. So once you've excluded logback, you now need to bring in log4j, and one of the easiest ways to do that is to just implement the starter for log4j, and that will transitively pull in all the other libraries that it needs. So if I head to my Gradle config here in IntelliJ, you can see, if I just make this a bit wider, you can see that including that Spring Boot starter for log4j will import not only the log4j core library, but also the slf4j library, which means you can use slf4j inside of your code to do the logging statements that you want to. So that's the only change that you need to bring into your build system, whether that's Gradle or Maven, in order to start using log4j. Okay, so once you've got your application configured, you can then go to your code and you can start using the slf4j logging framework to specify your log statements. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is obviously import the libraries you need from slf4j. In this case, I'm importing the logger and the logger factory, and then using that to define a normal class logger. And then you can also use that to specify your log statement. So in this case, inside of the home method, you can see there's a single debug statement that I am logging. If I scroll down, you'll see there's a second method in my code called health, and that has two different log statements. The first one is just an info level log that I'm specifying whenever the health method is invoked, and the second one is a error message which is invoked anytime the optional request parameter is not null. So in that way we can get a info level message printed whenever the method's invoked, and an error message if I specify a error parameter when I invoke this method. Okay, so now that you've seen the logging calls, let's head over to my log4j configuration file. I've called that log4j2.xml. And as you can see inside of this file, I've defined the appenders as well as a bunch of loggers. In the appender section, I've defined two appenders. The first one is called error file appender, which will write to a file called error.log, and the second one I've just called no-hub file appender, and that one will write to a no-hub.log file. And you can see the configuration for both of these appenders includes a pattern, which is what I want the messages to look like. And then I've also included a filter which specifies which messages should be accepted via these different appenders. So you can see in the error appender, it will accept anything that is above the error level, and anything that is below that will simply be denied. For the no-hub file appender, again, I've got a filter which says that anything that is below an error level should be accepted, and everything above that should be denied. You can see that I've declared three different loggers over here. The first one is simply for the Spring framework and anything for org.apache, and both of those have been turned off. And then my application logger is anything that starts with the package name za.co. And for that logger, you can see that I've specified both of those appenders, both the error file appender and the no file appender for where the messages should be directed to. Finally, you can see that I've set the additivity to false for this application logger, which means that the parent logger won't receive any of the messages um, that are defined via za.co or anything subsequent to that. So that's the configuration file that I'll be using for this demo. Okay, so now let me run the application, and I'll be using just IntelliJ to run the Spring Boot application. So let me first open up the run configuration so you can see all the configuration I'll be used to run it. And the first thing you can see is that I'm running using the dev profile, although that just allows me to specify certain development configurations which should be active. But the more important thing is that you can see I'm running with the environment variable log4j2.debug set to true. And that just enables me to see the configuration for log4j when the application starts up. So that might be something useful if you having trouble seeing what the log4j configuration is, or something isn't working as you expected, you can add that environment variable, and that will enable you to see how log4j has been configured. Okay, so now that you've seen the configuration, I'll just run the application. And as you can see, when the application starts up, there's a bunch of things that's printed from Log4j. You can see all the steps it goes through to initialize itself, all the classes that gets loaded. And if you look somewhere near the bottom, you should see some of those loggers that we've defined. The one for Spring Framework, my application logger, which starts with za.co, as well as the Apache logger and the appenders that I've specified. So if you specify that environment variable, you should then get a good idea of what your configuration looks like, as well as if it's picked up your configuration file. That might be very useful when debugging your logging configuration. Okay, so let me just clear the console, and then we can get to running some of the code I've shown you. So let's start with running the home controller, just the /home. And if I run that and I go to the log file, you can see that the only log lines inside of the log file are for the lines that were logged as the application startup, and there's no indication that I hit that home controller because it is currently only logging at the debug level, and the configuration I've specified only allows messages above info level. Just to confirm that, you can see anything logged in za.co requires at least an info level log. So the no help log doesn't include any call to the home controller, and the error log is still empty as well. So if I head back into this and I now run the home controller and I run the /health endpoint without any parameter being passed in, and you can see I get the expected response. If I go back to the no help file, you can see we now have a single info level log as expected, and that simply tells me that I've hit that health endpoint. If I look at the error log, you can see that log is still empty. So that log just wrote that single info level line to my health endpoint. So I'll now hit the home controller with the error status specified. And if I run that, you can see I get the expected response, but you can see a second info level line has been written to the home controller, which this time tells me that I've passed in an error parameter of 1. And if I go to the error log, you can see that for that call that we specified the error, we also get an error message in our error.log file. Okay, so that is pretty much what you expected to see with the way we've configured Log4j, and all the logging messages to come from home controller. So the last section I want to show you is just how you can use the actuator, if you've got that deployed as part of your Spring Boot application, to view your logging configuration at runtime, and also to change some of that configuration if you need to debug an application in production. So I'll open the actuator.http endpoint, and if we have a look, you can see that there are endpoints defined on the actuator, which enable you to see all of the loggers and what their various levels are. So if I just run that endpoint, if I go to um, this over here and run that, you can see we get quite a bit of output for all the different loggers that are defined, and also what the effective levels are for that logger. So if I go down somewhere near the bottom, you should be able to see that the za.co logger has a configured level of info, and the level that is currently effective for that is the info level logs. You can see that the za.co.vine has inherited that info level logs, and so even though I haven't explicitly defined it, you can see that the effective level for that logger would be info level. So that's useful if you just want a broad overview of all the different loggers and what the effective level for that logger would be. There's also a separate endpoint which enables you to see the logging level for a very specific logger. So in this case, if I just wanted to see what the logging level was for the home controller, I could execute this endpoint. And in that case, it gives me the output just for that one logger, and it tells me that the effective level for that logger is the info level. I can also use the actuator to set a logging level or to change a logging level for a specific logger. So if for argument's sake, I wanted to change the logging level for that home controller class that you saw to debug temporarily because I needed to resolve some issue in production, I can issue this post request, and I can run that post request. And if I go back and look at the logging level now, you can see that the configured level for that home controller is now debug, and of course the effective level is debug. And just to prove that, if I go to my home controller and I run that home endpoint again, and I go to the nohub file, you can now see that there is a debug line for that home controller that has been added to nohub.log because I've changed the effective level for the home controller to be debug. So that's all I wanted to show you in this demo, which included how to set up and configure your Log4j in your project so that it used Log4j for the logging framework instead of Logback, and also how you can interact with that in your code using the SLF4j framework so that you could, if you wanted to later, change out your logging framework to go back to something like Logback without needing to actually change any of your code because the API calls would still all be the same. And then how you could configure Log4j using something like an XML file to declare not only your appenders but also which messages should be logged to which files. And then finally how you can interact with the logging framework at runtime using the actuator framework for when you wanted to debug your application at runtime. Thank you very much.